Hello everyone! Our topic today is choosing the right board wipe for your deck. This is a pretty broad topic, so we will focus on a few areas that I think are important, yet I think are overlooked at times, especially if you are newer to the game or the format. Before diving into ways to choose better board wipes, first we need to be aware of why board wipes are such a powerful effect. So first, board wipes can even out the playing field. When you fall behind or your opponent gets too far ahead in the board state, cleaning up the board becomes really powerful. Yes, it wipes out your stuff too, but it does put the board state back to a more or less even playing field. Now you have a chance again, and your opponents who are close to victory has to rebuild all over again. Second, there's usually just so much stuff on the battlefield, often making single target removals impractical or simply not effective enough to stop your opponents. This is especially true with 4 players, and even more if the pot are leaning more towards battlecruiser magic. There are oftentimes just so many permanents, usually forming some sort of engine. Wiping the board is oftentimes the most efficient way to deal with it. And finally, board wipe tends to be global effects, which goes around various forms of protections. Most commonly perhaps being hexproof, where targeted removal just won't work. Then there's also protection from colors or other things, and board wipes usually just don't care about them. So there are many angles we can evaluate board wipes from. The obvious ones probably being what permanent types it affects. Another one being what type of removal it has. Is it a simple destroy effect like Breath of the God? Minus on toughness effects like Toxic Deluge? Sacrifice effect like Tragic Arrogance? Or exile effect like the now infamous Farewell? Instead, however, we will try look at board wipes from a tempo perspective. Tempo in a nutshell refers to how you pace playing your threats or answers such that you are ahead of your opponents. So a common misconception, especially to players newer to the game, is that board wipes are mostly these big spells that you cast on your turn in an attempt to get back into the game. I'm not saying that board wipes should not be played this way at all. In fact, there are plenty of situations where this is the optimal play. However, playing board wipes with only this mindset will more often than not put you behind on tempo. See, by playing board wipes this way, you are spending all your resources on your turn into that big board wipe. What happens next? Your opponents will be the first to untap and rebuild their boards, while you get to rebuild last. Again, putting you into a more reactive position. Alright, so with that, let's see how we can mitigate this loss of tempo. So the first angle we will look at is gaining tempo through mana. And by this, I mean simply looking at cheaper sorcery speed board wipes. So like we just mentioned, you often need to tap out to play a board wipe, thus not being able to play anything else on your turn. So obviously, if we can find cheaper board wipes, it will increase our chances to play something afterwards. This can either be something to balance out opponents getting to untap first, or even better, if we're left with even more resources, we can even play a threat that opponents might need to react to. So here are some staple board wipes that are known for being very cost effective. Blasphemous Act is a red sorcery that costs 8 and red. It has this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. Blasphemous Act deals 13 damage to each creature. So even though the converted mana cost is 9, most of the time this only costs 1 to play because more not than often there's just a ton of creatures on the battlefield. And the 13 damage is usually more than enough to kill most things. Vanquish the Horde is a white sorcery spell that costs 6 white. It has this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. Destroy all creatures. So it's very similar to Blasphemous Act in that its cost is reduced depending on the number of creatures on the battlefield. So most of the time this will only cast you 2 mana to cost, which is super efficient. And instead of the 13 damage that Blasphemous Act has, this has destroy all creatures, so it doesn't care about the toughness. And finally, we have Toxic Deluge. Toxic Deluge is a black sorcery that costs 2 and a black. As an additional cost to cast this spell, pay X life. All creatures get -X until end of turn. So It only costs 3, but you do have to pay life into it. But other than that, it's very cheap and very flexible. So next we will look at gaining tempo through timing, that is, instant speed board wipe. While previously we tried to gain tempo by being efficient on mana, with instant speed we can dictate the optimal time to wipe the board. This timing typically is just before our turn starts. This way, we'll let everyone play their threats and hopefully use up their resources. Then, we wipe the board just before our turn, then we will be the first one to untap, rebuild, and deploy our threats. This is even better if you have immediate threats. For example, some hasty boys that can attack immediately. The downside of instant speed board wipe is that you often pay a premium mana cost for it, which is kind of fair, since instant speed board wipe is a very powerful thing to do. And because it's such a powerful effect, there also aren't many instant speed board wipes that are being printed. But here are a couple of examples. First, we have Evacuation. Evacuation is a blue instant that costs 3 blue. It simply says return all creatures to their owner's hands. So pretty straightforward. You play this before your turn starts, bounces all creatures to their owner hands, and you'll be the first one to redeploy them. It's that simple. And then we have Rout. Rout is a white sorcery that costs 3 white. It says you may cast Rout as though it had flash if you pay 2 more to cast it. Destroy all creatures, they can't be regenerated. So it's a little bit more expensive to cast as a sorcery than Wrath of God, which is pretty much the same effect. But I really like the flexibility where you can pay 2 more to make it instant speed, which at the later game can be really powerful. As we mentioned, you gain a lot of tempo by casting this just before your turn starts. Last but not least, we'll look at gaining tempo through board wipes that asymmetrically benefits us more or hurts our opponents more. Asymmetric board wipes can be very costly mana-wise, but if it allows us to keep most of our stuff, it can really swing the momentum our way. So when it comes to asymmetrical board wipes, there are ones that sort of explicitly say so. They usually say stuff like, stuff your opponent controls. Those are easy, but they tend to be on the expensive side mana-wise, which makes sense because it has built-in non-conditional asymmetry, which is super easy to use and is extremely potent. So now we've gone over cheap sorcery board wipes, instant speed board wipes, and explicit asymmetrical board wipes. These are all pretty straightforward and pretty obvious to find. However, there's a final category I want to emphasize here, and I'm kind of making up the term here, but implicit asymmetry is where things can get really fun and where we can get creative. With implicit asymmetry, the card won't simply say, this card only affects your opponent. The board wipe card might say it affects both you and your opponents. However, in practice, the effect can lean a bit your ways because of how your deck is composed. So it's asymmetrical specifically for your deck only. Most decks usually has at least a couple of this kind of board wipe that can work. Note that these types of board wipes comes with a varying degree of asymmetry and are also more difficult to play. Depending on the board state and your deck, it might end up wiping more of your stuff than you wanted. Or in other cases, they might not wipe all of your opponent's things that you want to be gone. However, if we pick the right ones, they'll be gaining you the upper hand more often than not. So let's jump into specific examples to give you a better idea. So first, let's look at Baby Kaalia, built as an ETB reanimator deck, with of course angels, demons, and dragons. With almost all angels, demons, dragons being these big beefy flyers, there's some opportunity here to pick board wipes that affects opponents more than us. So first we have Ryusei the Falling Star. Ryusei the Falling Star is a red dragon spirit legendary creature that costs 5 and a red. It has flying, and it says when Ryusei the Falling Star dies, it deals 5 damage to each creature without flying. While the card does say it affects both us and our opponents, in practice, it will never affect us at all since our creatures are all flyers. Oops, sorry Shadowgrange Archfiend, but yeah. Next we have Massacre. It's a black sorcery that costs 2 black. It says if an opponent controls a plains and you control a swamp, you may play Massacre without paying its mana cost. All creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. So most of the time you can cast this card for free. And none of our creatures have toughness 2 or less. The lowest toughness in the deck is probably Kaalia herself, but still at 3 toughness. So Massacre will oftentimes just wipe your opponent's mana dorks and just various utility creatures. And next we have Toxic Deluge again. Toxic Deluge, black sorcery, costs 2 and a black. As an additional cost to cast the spell, pay X life. All creatures gets -X/-X until end of turn. So similar to Massacre, but not free. However, it's a lot more flexible in what to hit. If we have mostly 6/6s on the board, for example, we can do -5/-5 and wipe even more things. So next, let's look at Mazzy Truesword Paladin, who is a very aura-centric commander. First, we have Winds of Wrath. Winds of Wrath is a white sorcery that costs 3 white. Simply says, destroy all creatures that aren't enchanted. They cannot be regenerated. Well, this one is pretty obvious and why it's asymmetrical. Most likely, only our creatures have auras on them, so it will only affect our opponent's creatures. Now, the next couple of board wipes that I'm going to show you are super effective, but they're even better if we tailor the deck to support it. So I think that most Mazzy builds don't really have or need a lot of artifacts. Here, we have the option to cut as many artifacts away from the deck or even just not play any artifacts at all. Doing so will make these board wipes even more potent. So first we have Meltdown. Meltdown is a red sorcery that costs X and red. It says destroy each artifact with total casting cost X or less. So if we have very few artifacts in our deck, or none at all, this will be a one-sided board wipe for all the artifacts on play. We can easily put 2 into X to wipe out all mana rocks, thus really slowing down our opponents. Or for example, we can pay 4 into it. That will probably get rid of most kind of utility artifacts, like Panharmonicon, for example. And finally, if we go tall or somewhat Voltron-y, beefing up our few creatures to be huge with auras, combined with the fact that we're not playing that many artifacts, Structural Assault becomes a really good board wipe. Structural Assault is a red sorcery that costs 3 red. It says destroy all artifacts, then Structural Assault deals damage to each creature equal to the number of artifacts that were put into graveyards from the battlefield this turn. So in practice, it wipes out all artifacts, and then if there are enough artifacts, probably all creatures on the board. However, by playing only few or no artifacts at all, and having our creatures beefed up with auras, or even having the auras that gives our creature totem armor, Structural Assault can become a very one-sided board wipe. Our final example for implicit one-sided board wipe here is Doran. Oh boy, there is just so many good options for a one-sided board wipe here. If you're not familiar with Doran, with him on the battlefield, all creatures assign their toughness as combat damage. So toughness matters, and our creatures will have very high toughness, even more so than the angels, demons, dragons, and kaalia. And not just that, another trait we can also take advantage of here is that most of our creatures have very low power as well. So let's look what we can use here. So first we have Elspeth. Elspeth is a white planeswalker that costs 4 and white. It has a -3 ability that says destroy all creatures with power 4 or greater. So almost none of our creatures has power 4 or higher. So this is almost always guaranteed a one-sided board wipe. Then we have Dusk Dawn. Dusk is so this is a split card. Dusk is a white sorcery that costs 2 white, and it says destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. So same as Elspeth, but might hit a little bit more of our creatures because it destroys all creatures with power 3 or greater. But it's still very good for our deck. And as a bonus, the other side, Dawn, it can get us back most of our creatures. So this is just very good here. And then we have Toxic Deluge again. So I'm not going to read it because we already mentioned it several times, but similar to Kaalia, but most likely even better here considering all the super high toughness creatures we have, it will hit even more of our enemies' creatures and less of ours. Next we have Fell the Mighty, a white sorcery that costs 4 and white. It says destroy all creatures with power greater than target creature's power. Another really flexible one. We can go aggressive and pick a creature of ours with very low toughness. Or we can also go a bit conservative and don't go too low so that it won't hit too much of our stuff. But in the end, because our creatures are very low powered, with Doran having 0 power, we'll most likely come out ahead. Next we have Nightmare Unmaking. Nightmare Unmaking is a black sorcery that costs 3 black. It says choose one, exile each creature with power greater than the number of cards in your hand, or exile each creature with power less than the number of cards in your hand. So this is similar to Fell of the Mighty, but a bit harder to manipulate since it depends on our hand size. The upside, however, is that it's an exile effect. But again, we most likely have creatures with lowest power, so we'll probably again come out ahead. Finally, we have Wave of Reckoning. Wave of Reckoning is a white sorcery that costs 4 and a white. It says each creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. So, this is interesting. Remember how earlier we mentioned that the downside of a lot of these implicit asymmetrical board wipe is that it might not affect opponents as much? Well, Wave of Reckoning gets closer to mitigating that downside. See, the other board wipes before this won't work too well if our opponents have big beefy creatures. One thing, however, is that aside from our tree folk-like creatures, not a lot of creatures have very low power and very high toughness. More often than not, they have equal power and toughness. This is where Wave of Reckoning really shines. It will wipe out creatures with equal power and toughness, but not the ones with lower power than its toughness. This is just great. So to summarize, let's go back to our board wipe tempo diagram. We covered gaining tempo through mana value with cards like Blasphemous Act. We also covered gaining tempo through timing with cards like Evacuation. And finally, we also saw how powerful asymmetrical board wipes can be in generating tempo with cards like Ruinous Ultimatum. But what about board wipes with more than one of these tempo sources? That would be so strong, right? That's probably why there aren't many cards printed that lies within these intersection. There's an infamous which you probably know, and it combines asymmetry effect with timing. Can you guess? Yep, it's Cyclonic Rift, of course. But aside from that, there aren't really many cards like this. However, by playing board wipes that are implicitly asymmetrical or one-sided, we can sort of cheat here. Since on print they are actually symmetrical, they typically don't have a premium mana cost. However, because of their synergy with our deck, they'll practically have a one-sided effect. So, if we can find these cards, we'll have board wipes that gives us tempo advantage from both mana value and one-sided effects. So there you go. I hope this gives you another angle, tempo, from which to evaluate board wipe cards from. I also hope this gives you some inspiration to pick the right board wipes for your deck, especially those sweet one-sided board wipes that works with your deck specifically. If you got any ideas, or maybe you're already using some in your decks, please share with us in the comments. I would love to hear about them. And if you find this video helpful, please hit that like button and consider subscribing. It will let me know to make more similar videos in the future. With that, thank you so much for watching, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.